It's just a huge honor today to be podcast interviewing David Haynes, MBA. He's from First Citizens Bank, and this is going to be an amazing podcast. I mean, he does entirely dentistry. I mean, this is all he does. He has an educational background in accounting and finance. Professionally, he has owned, operated, and sold a business, which experience he uses to benefit his clients. His career in banking began as an analyst underwriter. Currently, he holds the title of Vice President and Business Banker at First Citizens Bank right here in Scottsdale, Arizona, specializing in dental finance. Previously, he taught and assisted in developing B475 financing new ventures for BYU, Idaho. David was inducted to Beta Gamma Sigma, recognizing his high scholastic achievement in business school. He likes fast cars, motorcycles, Greek food, and fishing. We must be related somehow. He is blessed with a beautiful wife and 2 sons. I beat you there. I had 4 sons. So
yeah, we'll let you have that.
You'll let me have that.
Let you have that.
You'll pass on that one. How's dentistry doing?
Dentistry, so my focus, to kind of set the context, I'm focused solely in Phoenix. So, I see things that are happening in other markets, but my focus here in the Phoenix area, with that as a backdrop, that from a lending standpoint, it's doing very well. The portfolio, our dental portfolio is very strong. There's a lot of demand, amongst buyers and sellers, folks interested in transitioning and growing. Generally speaking, our default rates are very low. This is the local economy, and especially as it relates to dentistry, appears to be, very strong for the time being.
Our governor, what is our governor's name? Ducey. I'll pull it up. He passed a law that allows anybody who's a licensed dentist in the United States to move here. It's something that dentists have been asking for. They don't like to. It seems kind of weird that you graduate from an accredited dental school in the United States, but you can't go practice without taking a state license, and in other states, and all that kind of stuff. Do you think that will have a material impact on the dental business? Do you think more dentists will move to Arizona to buy practices because of that, or not really?
That's difficult to say, and I should add my disclaimer. So I work for the bank. My opinions that I express today are my own, right? They're not the bank's opinions. I'm not the bank's economist. So these are my own thoughts. But I don't really see that. I mean, Arizona seems to be already a hotbed for dental activity, and there's already a number of dental schools here and folks that are in the area. It's hard to imagine that that law will have a material impact on other folks relocating to this area for that reason. Now, it may be that certain docs see opportunities here because of that, I don't see it having that material of an impact.
To me, what is very interesting is when the ADA, which has their chief economist Marco Vucicic, PhD, he's from the World Health Organization. When the American Dental Association landed him, I couldn't believe it. I mean, he's like the best healthcare economist I've even ever heard of, and the ADA has him. But he does some amazing work. But Arizona's been ground zero for DSOs. 18% of the dentists in Arizona participate in a DSO, while many states are at 0%, but it has the most DSO activity. So is do you do a lot of work with DSOs?
No. So the primary client for myself and really, for a lot of, local banks and local lenders is the owner operator that has, his own shop, his or her own shop, and has a desire to either expand, grow that practice and spend their career there as an owner operator. We do very little with large corporate groups. There's some smaller, that I'll call them, small corporate groups that own maybe a few practices. They're kind of, They're on a much smaller scale, but for the most part, we're dealing with owner users that have a desire to, buy a practice, expand their practice, start a practice, that type of thing. And there's a tremendous amount of activity,
which
in that
is
space.
where dentistry, this whole DSO thing has been a very short period of time, considering that dentistry started by Pierre Fauchard hundreds of years ago. But to me, I only see any successes with humans is when they have skin in the game.
Yeah.
And when a dentist owns their office, they net $100,000 a year more when they're an employee somewhere else. I mean, humans, you either own your own bowling ball, so you have skin in the game and you bowl regularly and you're real good, or you haven't been bowling in 10 years. And I don't see the market where I go to school 8 years and then just become your employee, have no skin in the game, and we all live happily ever after. I think it's a very transitional thing. So are you mostly loaning money to buy a practice?
We're doing a lot of practice transitions, certainly. We're also financing a lot of expansion. There's a pretty common scenario for us is a doctor has a single office and wants to grow their practice by either adding a second location, buying the suite next door, and expanding their physical presence. So transition piece is certainly a big part of it. The construction lending, piece of it is also a significant play for us, and we see a tremendous amount of demand in that space.
It's so Dentaltown has 50 forms, and one of the forms is practice transitions, and I think it's one of the most. We both have an MBA, so if you have an MBA and you love business, the practice transition forms, associates corner, partnerships and associates, practice acquisitions. So if your business is doing well, then dentistry is expanding. I mean, you seem to have a lot of activity for wanting access to capital to expand their business.
Oh, absolutely. Arizona has seen higher valuations recently across the board, with practices, with real estate, with construction costs. There's just a tremendous amount of the increase in cost just across the board is been pretty strong. And so, we have a number of buyers, that we've come in contact with that are looking for ways to facilitate that growth. And that can be through a transition. It can be through that, like I said, that construction element, which carries a lot of risk. There's a lot of ways to get there. But the transition side is certainly a big play for a lot of folks. And the supply and demand, at least here in Phoenix, seems to be a little bit mismatched right now. The demand appears to be much higher, than there is supply of really good practices. And what I've seen is a willingness by some doctors to look at practices that maybe they weren't originally interested in. Maybe they decide to buy a practice or expand, and they want to pick up patients. And what they're doing is possibly considering a practice that they may not have otherwise considered. Maybe it's got some sort of a issue or quirk or something that doesn't match their skill set very well, but they're still entertaining that because of this kind of mismatch with supply and demand in the market. And so what I've found or seen is that the doctors that really want to buy a practice and expand, they have to be aggressive and network and kind of put themselves out there, and try and find opportunities or help uncover opportunities to an extent on their own, and then from there they can, open some more doors potentially.
Now I'm going to give away my jaded 57 years of age. To me, when there's everything you're describing is the top of a bubble. I mean, I graduated from high school in 80. That's when the biggest bubble I saw popped in 87, 2000, Lehman's Day, 2009. What you're describing is a lot, at the top of a bubble, you see all this type of activity. Do you think, is there a dental bubble going on? Do you see that?
I would say possibly. I mean, I look at dentistry a little bit like maybe like a government, right? So, governments, there's been a lot of discussion about like state and local governments, having fiscal issues, financial issues, and it's really hard to kill a government, right? Just the money just keeps coming in, and so they have much longer staying power than private organizations. But I would say the dental industry, in some ways, for that fact alone, is somewhat similar. The money, doesn't ever shut off completely. They're not like contractors, right? When the economy tanks and there's a contractor that's really busy, they go from busy to zero. The dentist doesn't typically experience that. At least it doesn't seem like they experience that extreme of a drop. So is there a bubble? It's possible. Valuations are higher. People are borrowing more. The student debt situation I see folks with really high amounts of student debt. It's not uncommon to see $400,000+ in student debt, and they're on income-based repayment, and then they're still living. They're still living to the maximum that they can afford personally. They're spending on cars and so if there's a couple grand extra because they're on income-based repayment, if they were actually amortizing that loan, they'd have a lot less money. But because they're on income-based repayment, they'll, a lot of docs are spending well in excess of their means, and that issue, a lot of folks are counting on that income-based repayment that debt to be forgiven after, a period of time. And that's of course going to create a taxable event. So is there a bubble? It's possible. I don't see the folks that are operating on the fringe, those are the folks that will be hurt in some sort of a downturn. It'll happen at some point. I mean, there's no question that there will be a downturn. And those that are operating right to their limit from a borrowing capacity from personal and business, those are the folks that will suffer. But aside from that, will it be far-reaching into the entire dental, into the entire dental community? I have a hard time seeing that. The really successful offices that have good amount of cash flow and low leverage, I don't see that. I don't see that bubble popping for them.
So the contractor in a downturn gets shut off to zero. Dentists don't. Why do you think that is?
Well, the need for, dentistry is ongoing. I mean, if your tooth hurts, you're going to do something about it. I mean, and if you need, and comparing that to the contractor, if you're contemplating a large project, well, we can hold off on that, right? So the human need is there, and what will happen with all this growth? How will doctors adjust in a downturn? What ways will they continue driving business? That'll be interesting to see. But I think just that human need that always exists does shield the dental industry to an extent. But that's not to say that folks wouldn't suffer in a downturn. Given
all I can say on the first part about living beyond your means, it's to me, it's associated with where you're born. If you're born in the United States, you live above your means your entire life. The only dentists I see living below their means is that they came here. They weren't born in the United States, and the poorer the country they were born in, the better they'll do. They'll come out of a school with $400,000 student loans. They'll go buy an office. They'll live in the office. They won't have a car or a house. Yeah. They have their iPhone, and that's the only number they market. And they tell me, oh yeah, 5 o'clock, all the born in America dentists go home. And then I get a toothache, a broken tooth. And it's Master Charge, Visa, American Express and they just do so well. But I often talk to many dentists, and I'll say, you told me about your vacation. It was Hawaii. Your car. Show me one item in your personal expenditures where you live below your means. They can't name one.
It almost doesn't exist, and it's a cultural flaw, I guess. To your point, there's very little pride in the dental community in that vein of saving money and being thrifty. There's not very many people that take pride in that. It's more of, hey, I'm proud to show you what we did or what I just bought, and it is kind of a cultural. It is a bit of a cultural issue. And in terms of buying practices, these folks will live right on the edge, and if you're going to try and buy a practice and your credit's got a hiccup or issue, it's really difficult. You're going to end up paying more. You may not get the practice. Somebody may beat you out that's got a commitment. So, in terms of facilitating your future success, it's in the doctor's best interest to live below their means, not be on the fringe, and risk credit issues that we're going to pick up and have an issue with.
And I will be blunt and say the truth. It is, in my opinion and experience, that dentists, physicians, and lawyers attract spouses who want to live above their means. They almost never marry a school teacher who wants to go camping at the lake. It's always someone who wants a Range Rover, a cruise, a European vacation. They just attract people who love to live above their means. So probably a quarter of everyone listening to you right now is in dental school, and probably almost all the rest are under 30. So when are they ready to buy a practice? I mean, when they come out of school, can they get financing to buy a practice right away? Should they wait a year?
It's difficult. So let me back up to your just prior comment, and I'll answer this question as well. But talking about the spouses, we see a really high divorce rate among dentists, and it is extremely difficult for that not to impact your practice in some way. And circling, also to the credit discussion about personal credit, almost 100% of the time when somebody goes through a marital issue, whether it be temporary separation or divorce, they almost always come away with some sort of scar on their personal credit. It almost always happens. And so this issue of living within your means and some of these issues that we see very commonly of divorce in the dental community, I mean, it is just such a prevalent thing, and it can cause some major issues as you're buying a practice or throughout your career. I have one doctor right now that just got divorced, and sure enough came away with some credit issues. Had some things in mind that he wanted to do, prior to this, and all that was put on hold and ended up it's a mess. And so there's we see that a lot. It's unfortunate, but I think that living within your means is definitely one of those ways to at least hedge some of that. But anyways, what was your other question? I forgot your other question.
And the other thing about living within means, a lot of spouses I feel sorry for, because they hear the wrong message. Like the spouse will say, "Well, how much you charge for a crown?" You say $1,000, and then you come home and say, "Oh my God, I need 5 crowns today." So she's thinking you made 5,000. She didn't know that you charge 1,000, but the PPO only pays you 600, and that you have 65% overhead. And so it's now gone from $5,000 to now you netted $800 today or something. After all is done and said. So again, it's communication. You're not being transparent with your financial accounting, your managerial accounting. And if they see you go to work and come home beat up and tired, and then they start seeing it's for this little amount of money, they make better decisions. But there's so many spouses who are completely disconnected from the transparency of your accounting.
No, that's totally true. And now to answer your other question, coming out of school, my preference is to finance folks that have at least a few years of experience out of school, and they've had an opportunity to perhaps pay down some debt, personal debts, and save up some liquidity, so they're more prepared for a purchase. It's possible that somebody right out of school could find a bank to loan them money, but there is just experience is that experience, that couple years of experience being in office and working, and that's just so valuable. And I personally, it would make me nervous to finance somebody straight out of school, especially if they were interested in a startup. Now, if it's somebody out of school and they're wanting to do a buy-in and they've maybe got some experience with that that practice somehow, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a related practice that's somehow related. That might be a different scenario. But for the most part, I think folks that are coming out of school, just take a deep breath. Don't go blow the bank right away when you come out of school and start making money. Be conservative and try and save some money and work on those personal debts as much as you can, and then go from there. Look to buy or take that next step, whatever that is.
So I agree that when you come out of dental kindergarten, you just got a license, and you're going to need to practice. Your talking to patients, cleanings, exams, simple crown and bridge, simple endo, and you like them to have 1 or 2 years of the basics before they start thinking of.
At least, yeah, absolutely.
And so then her next thought is, and by the way, you spend most of your time in Phoenix, but this is the fifth most populous city in the United States. I mean, Phoenix is
a huge market.
It's a big sample. And there's not a lot of weird things about it that, there's things in New York City that don't apply to Wichita, Kansas, but Phoenix is a pretty simple economy. I think it's a good reflection of the country. The first thing they want to think of is, should I do a de novo and start from scratch, or should I buy an existing? How should she wrap her mind around that?
That's a good question, and I'm not a huge fan of scratch starts if you've got no experience owning a practice. And it's possible that you can certainly get that, you can get it done. There's a lot of people that do it. My preference is to see people buy something with established cash flow. To me, that risk is much lower if you've properly done your research and underwritten the opportunity and done your due diligence. If you've made sure that there's not an issue with that practice you're buying, I much prefer to see folks go out and buy those existing cash flows. That adds some level of predictability to what's going on. When I scratch starts, the type of scratch start that I prefer is one that's really an expansion of an existing practice, right? I like if there's a doctor that has a practice and they want to grow that practice with a brand new location. That to me is much easier pill to swallow than somebody coming out, getting a few years of experience, and then doing a scratch start. That's just an extremely difficult situation. You're going to be going from 0 to 100, and it happens overnight. You're going to be running a business. You've got bills to pay, a loan to pay. I mean, there's a lot of things. And look, people do it all the time.
So you're saying, because I don't think she knows what cash flow means, but you're saying if she buys a practice, it already has a history of an amount of cash flowing in every month. Whereas if she starts a scratch practice, de novo from ground up, you have nothing to base estimates of what kind of cash flow is going to come in.
Yeah.
So it's just a higher risk because it's all unknown.
It's all unknown, and a lot of people think if you build it, they will come kind of thing, and that may be true, but the chances are your cost to build that out. Talk about just the construction element, right? If you're doing a scratch start, you've all of a sudden entered the world of construction, and there's only well, that's assuming that you're going to be building a place from scratch, right? I mean, you could buy an existing office that's already built out. That may be possible. Well, let's just say you want to, you find a nice shell that's in a new part of town that's not already built out, and you want to do that and start from scratch. That is, you went from, being in school to now all of a sudden you're managing a construction project essentially, and there's only about 100 different pitfalls when you're in construction, even for experienced, business people. The construction world, I have somebody that's dealing with this right now where their contractor went bankrupt in the middle of the project. That happens a lot, even in this good economy. This particular contractor went bankrupt, and it causes a mess. And so it only takes 1 or 2 deviations from the plan, such as that being one of them, potential issue with the contractor, to really cause a significant issue, and then that would ripple to affect the personal credit. So, in my mind, it's not risk-free buying a practice. There's certainly risks. How are those patients going to transition? How are you going to interact with the selling doctor? There's a lot of things to consider, but it's to me that risk is much less than it is, starting from scratch, and especially if you're going to start from scratch and have to build a space or build out a space.
Another question I asked is, would you say that the average price of a dental office is about $750?
$750? Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
That's not. I mean, that's a very common.
Well, I try to think of it as liquidity. Like in Arizona, if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house to sell, I mean, you list it anywhere in the valley, you can unload it in a month.
Sure.
But if you're an NFL player and you just had your knee blown and you're trying to unload your 9-bedroom, 5-car garage for over $1 million, it becomes a very illiquid asset. So is it safe to say that if you're thinking about selling your dental office someday and you have a 750,000 to $1 million practice, that it's pretty liquid and be easy to sell? But once you have like a $2 or $3 or $4 million practice, it becomes more of an illiquid asset?
Well, talking about the practice itself, no, I don't think so. I think there's a tremendous amount of demand right now if you have a practice that's performing that well, you've got individual buyers that are interested, and that's up to maybe the several million mark, right? 2 to 3 million, maybe on the high end. It's your buyer pool amongst owner users gets a little bit smaller above that threshold, right? There's fewer buyers for that $3 to $4 million practice, but I think generally speaking, there's still a tremendous amount of demand. And
for even the big ones?
I think even the big ones.
But would that only be being bought by DSOs and not individual owner operators?
You're going to see, above that, call it 2.5 million mark, 3 million mark. That's going to attract a lot more attention from private equity. We have many folks that are approached by private equity. A lot of my clients will call us up and say, "Hey, I'm being approached by private equity. What do you think?" Just to bounce that off of you. And that happens a lot. They have a plan in place here. You'll work in the practice. It seems like a pretty sweet deal. They pay a premium, but it doesn't continue their legacy. At some point, they lose control of that practice, and they really don't. That happens in a sale to another owner user.
But I imagine living in Arizona where 18.7% of all dentists are somehow involved with DSO. That's much more common event than, say, if you were in Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, or Delaware, which are all at 0%.
Oh yeah, no, it happens. It's definitely a force in the marketplace. But yeah, back to that original question. If you have a practice to sell that's doing that amount, you're gonna have some interest. Just depends on maybe which segment you hit, and you want to make sure that you've got the right support to find qualified buyers. I mean, that's there's a lot of folks that would be interested in a $2 million practice. Finding qualified buyers that can actually afford and get financing on a $2 million practice, that may be harder to weed out than you think. So having the proper support there is critical.
I know you and I both have an MBA, and we see valuations very differently. But the dentists you talk to, they always have this rule of thumb. They always think like, well, my office collects $1 million, it'll sell for $1 million. Or any of those non-accounting terms, techniques hold any water? Are there any easy rule of thumbs?
Sure. I mean, there's the easy rule of thumbs. I mean, are there variations from that though? Yeah. And that's where you need an expert. I'm not a valuation expert per se. I mean, I see a lot of valuations. I have to make judgment calls on if this is valuated properly, but I don't actually perform the appraisal. So I defer to, other experts on that, but there are a lot.
You got a good practice appraisal guy in town here?
Oh, there's many. I shouldn't say many. There's several that do that appraise.
You got one in your mind that's really, really good?
Yeah.
If you do, send them down here.
I'll send them down here. How about
because
that?
Because they always say the same thing. They say, well, if your office collects $1 million, it's worth $1 million. I'm like, dude, just think about it. What if there's two offices that do $1 million? You'll work your butt off, and one guy takes home $100,000 a year, and one guy takes home $200,000 a year. Don't you think the guy in the office taking home $200,000 has a higher value? So send them down because
the equipment is a factor. The lease is a factor, right? I mean, the lease is probably the number one sticking point in a transition and in the valuation of a practice, in my opinion. That's the one big elephant in the room that you can't change very easily, right? You can't move. If you move, you're gonna have some build out costs. Probably you're gonna have, if you want to buy there's just like a million things. But if you're paying $100,000 on a lease, and I've seen this, I've seen some practices doing under $1 million in revenue, and they have a lease that costs them $100,000 a year. The math just doesn't make sense.
How does that happen?
Well, they go and they get into a really nice building. And it's kind of that if you build it, they will come mentality, right? If we build some ops in a really nice building in an expensive part of town, that this will just happen, right? And that's not always the case. And the lease, to me, is the number one sticking point in transition. If you're paying over market for a lease, or if the practice can't afford the lease that's in place, that's the most difficult thing. The supply. If you're paying too much for supplies, okay, we can possibly fix that problem. If you're paying, some staff member too much, we might be able to fix that problem with some ramifications. There's a lot of things in the P&L that you can fix. The lease is probably the number one item that can cause a problem, and people are always overly optimistic about when they're looking at an opportunity. They're always overly optimistic about the lease. Well, it has this feature, so we should be able to overcome that obstacle and grow this practice. There's always kind of this benefit of the doubt when if you just look at the numbers, it doesn't make sense. And it's important to do your research. I think part of doing transitions well and growing your practice well is having the right team around you, right? The bankers are definitely a critical piece of that, but having a real estate guy in your, that you trust, that you can say, hey, what do you think about this lease? And have that lease reviewed periodically. Having a transition person involved, having an accountant involved, there's some really great dental consultants out there that can, help advise on the practice and the operations of the practice itself. Those are things that I don't look at. I don't get into the nitty-gritty operations of the practice. We look at the numbers. If it works, it works. If it seems to be a match in skill set, we move forward. But I don't get into a ton of those details, frankly. And so that's where you need a good team, surrounding you
Speaking of bundling, are you mostly doing transactions where Sally's buying Sue's dental office, or she's also buying the dental office and the real estate land and building? And when they're young, they're thinking, well, if I'm going to come out of AT still and I'm going to buy a practice, and I'm going to practice from 25 to 65, I don't want to rent for 4 years.
Yeah.
I want to buy the land and building. So is that a good idea to bundle land building practice? Is it two separate transactions? Are they two separate bankers? How should she wrap her head around bundling real estate and business?
Generally the same banker can take care of that. I do a lot of the real estate and the practice. That's all part of that same discussion, right? So that's usually going to be typically the same banker. If your banker can't do one or the other, that's weird. That'd be strange. But I like it when folks purchase real estate. I think it's a great way to build net worth. Generally speaking, when that practice is sold, let's say way down the road, they decide to sell the practice and they want to retain the real estate. That real estate can eventually be sold to an outside investor, or that can be sold to the buyer of the practice eventually. And usually that's at a pretty good premium. And so personally, I think that getting into real estate when there's adequate liquidity and success within the practice, I think that's a great thing. I don't like seeing it too much when there's a younger doctor buying a practice and then immediately buying real estate. That's a lot more leverage. That's more cash that it requires, and typically that's just not feasible, right? So, in a lot of cases, the doctors are fairly, I don't want to say lucky, but they're getting into the practice, and that's probably enough of a project. Buying the real estate at the same time. So I like it when it's a little bit staggered, right? So they buy their practice, and then there's a little bit of a time gap between then and when they buy the real estate. That's not always possible, but generally when a practice transition happens, there's a long-term lease there. Most banks will require there to be a lease term that matches the loan term. So generally that's not going to come up immediately, but in some cases they want to unload the real estate. And if it's an experienced doctor that's got the liquidity, then more power to you. That's great. You can go for it. But for a younger doctor to come out, buy a practice, and buy the real estate, that's a tremendous amount of debt, generally speaking, and that would be a little bit more difficult. I
think you're gonna have a lot of opportunities. Again, I graduated in 1980. That was the worst I've ever seen in the economy. 21% interest rates, double-digit unemployment, inflation. Graduated May 11, 87. Got my office open 133 days later. 28 days before Black Monday, a 25% drop. And not to mention the Y2K bubble and the Lehman's Day 10 years ago. But what happened to me, I was renting. But when I saw that one day drop of 25%, it really crushed the real estate in 4 states. Yeah. It was Texas, Arizona, California, and Florida. Were hit the hardest. I think they had half the damage in those 4 states. So I saw a $600,000 pad be put up for sale, and nobody bought. So 2 or 3 years later, I finally bought it for $285.
Yeah.
I actually bought 4 pads, and all of those, the 3 I didn't buy, all doubled back to their original gain as the financial leveraging. So it's always a cycle. I'll give you another one. Like in 1970, there were 10,000 microbreweries. And then, so what is it? What's natural? It consolidated down to 70. And then what's natural? They unconsolidate, and now we're back to 10,000. So I've lived long enough to go from 10,000 to 70 to 10,000 breweries. You saw it on dental supplies when I got out of school. There was a dental supply dealer in every state. And then the consolidators came along, like Pete Frechette with Patterson, and he just went and consolidated them all up. And then there was just a couple of big ones. There was Patterson, Shine, Benco, Burkhart. And now you see dental supply companies just popping up everywhere. I mean, I think we've done 5 or 6 podcasts on dental supply groups. There's one every time you turn around. So there's these cycles. And right now you've had a long leveraging up cycle, which will always be followed by a long leveraging down cycle. And a lot of these DSOs, where there's public information, their debt is considered junk debt. And so what I see is that, the average DSOs probably got 30 offices, 10 of them are real good, 10 of them are okay, and 10 of them are dogs.
There's always a normal distribution there, yeah.
Yeah, and during a economic deleveraging, they're going to put all their dogs up for sale. I think a lot of you guys right now that are associates, I think you're going to see some bargains. And you're always going to find bargains and financial deleveraging. But what is a lot of people don't want to have a dental consultant or don't want to try to ask you if they can borrow money for a loan because they're just afraid that there's something wrong with their credit. When someone comes to you and says, I want to buy Joe's office, and you say, sorry, what derails it? What did they do wrong? Is it their FICO score? Is it their
what did they do wrong? I mean, the credit, we talked about that a little bit. I mean, that's probably the biggest hindrance for a lot of folks. If there's a credit issue, that's a really difficult thing to overcome. If it's a one-time event, we can sometimes wrap our arms around that, right? If they had some late pays, occasionally a bank is able to underwrite around, certain issues that are isolated, and if there's a reasonable explanation for that, but typically if there's a major credit event, that's very difficult to overcome.
What are those?
What's that?
What are those? What are
short sale, foreclosure, bankruptcy, yeah, and
so there's dental students that come out of dental school with a bankruptcy.
Well, we don't typically the dental students. Those are
let's say they're 2 years out of school, 3 years out of school.
Yeah, well, we see it. Yeah,
it's common for someone 3 years out of dental school.
I wouldn't say it's common, but it happens.
Really?
There's an individual I talked to recently that traveled around, they went to school in one location and they did a residency in another location. And so they bought a house in the first location. They couldn't sell the house. And this was several years after the worst of the recession. But the problem for them was that they got into real estate and then they couldn't find a renter. They had other bills to pay. And so they short sold the house.
Okay. What does that mean? She doesn't know what short sold the house means.
Yeah. So they sold the house for less than what it was worth. And the bank took a loss. The bank,
So a short sale is when you sell your house for less than you owe on it.
Less than you own it,
and the bank writes that off.
Yep.
And then that'll be a blemish on your credit for how long?
That's gonna follow you for a long time. I think it's 7 years is how long stays on there.
And then statutory, legally, they just erase it or they quit.
When you fill out a personal financial statement at a bank, usually they're gonna ask, "Have you ever had?" We don't really care what shows up on the credit report. Have you ever had a bankruptcy? Have you ever had a short sale? And so we will generally try and uncover that regardless, of when the time was. But typically after that 7 and 10 year mark, it's much less of an issue, right? If you had an issue that was beyond that point, it's generally not going to be as significant of an issue, and you'll probably find a bank that will finance you.
And how much off-market activity? Explain what off-market activity is, and then is that very common in dentistry?
Off-market activity. So that is when two buyers and sellers get together and agree to do a transaction essentially without a broker involved, right? Something they're uncovering an opportunity without a formal listing taking place, and we see a tremendous amount of off-market activity here.
Really?
There's
in selling practices.
Yeah, we've just completed. There's mergers that take place. We've done. There's acquisitions. There's buy-ins, buyouts. Of associates. There's all types of activity that takes place off market. I would say our production is a significant portion of at least my production and the local Arizona production is off market activity. Things that are happening, without a broker involved. Now, a lot of that is associate buy-ins. They think, well, we don't really need the help, right? I already know the buyer and the seller. We've known each other for maybe a year or two now, and we've come together. We've come to terms with, a price. We kind of know how we'd like to operate, and then they just want to, do that transaction essentially on their own, right, without any formal listing process or a lot of help. And they'll
but the owner's not personally caring. He wants you to
that's right.
buy
We'll
this
finance
contract.
it. That's right. Yeah.
And I'm kind of when you get old, everything seems to be better when you were young than now. In the old day, if I sold you a practice in 1980, I carried, and it was always 10% interest. And what I liked about that is the owner. If I'm going to carry the loan, I know you'll never be a successful dentist in Wichita, Kansas because of whatever. I think there are better deals. I've seen some deals out here in Arizona where someone will have like a $1.5 million cosmetic full mouth rehab practice, sell it to some kid out of school who didn't have any of these skill sets, and then lose the whole thing. And so was it better having owner carry, or if this person's associates buying in, do you like them to carry half the loan and you cash out the other half? Or I
personally love owner carry. I like that there's a vested interest. I mean, anytime that we can see that the seller has a vested interest in the success of the practice, that's a good thing. Long transition plans. I generally like to see longer transition plans. If there's a way to make it work, right? If there's enough ops and work, if they can somehow figure out a way to stay involved in the practice, I like seeing that. When the seller owns the real estate, I like that as well. That's another thing that owner of the building is interested in your success. So those are all very good things. If you compare the dental market to, let's just say, the CPA transition market, previously in a prior life, I had financed some CPA practices, and in almost 100%, I don't know why the CPAs have done this and this hasn't translated to other industries or vice versa, but CPAs almost always, when they sell their practice, they almost always have a seller carry note with an earn-out period. And so they'll say, if the practice, doesn't perform to the expectation, there's a calculation that happens at the end of year one that says the note amount is actually reduced by the dollar amount that the clients don't come over. And so that's kind of an earn-out clause, I guess, in quick summary. But they all, CPA valuations had gone up and up and up for a long time, and got to the point where I think banks were getting nervous. And so to help bridge some of that gap, they started doing seller carry notes with these earn-out clauses. And I like that it keeps it adds some protection to the buyer. Those. Not every seller carry has an earn-out, right? But I like that. I like those features. Everybody's interested in the success of the practice at that point. So I personally like seeing those. It's not very common. This is banks across the board. This isn't just us across the board. Banks are lending, higher and higher amounts for practices, and this has happened over a period of time. Loan to revenue, talking about that calculation, banks have gotten more comfortable over time with higher loan to revenue and lending 100% of that. So, why would a seller take on that risk when the bank is willing to lend 100%? And so, will we see more seller carry notes as banks get uncomfortable? Possibly, that may happen, but it's in that buyout, in the associate buy-in situation, that's an extremely difficult agreement to to figure out in the first place, and they're difficult to unwind as well. A lot of people don't think about, the logistics, the details in their contract on how everything's going to work, how our distribution is going to work going forward. How's the practice going to be managed? And so the dynamic in the office changes from when somebody goes from an associate to 50% owner. And so how does that all take place? It's very difficult. I generally like seeing the seller carry note for ensuring the long-term success of the practice.
We talked about personal divorce at the beginning. Do you see a lot of partners 50-50 going through divorce? I mean, we do see that to an extent. I mean, usually there's a lot of, more than that, we hear of people interested in a partnership. They get down the road and they just can't come to terms with on the agreement, and then that just blows up. So that's the more common scenario. Once they've figured out the partnership and have come to terms with an agreement, we don't see a whole lot of business divorce. At least I haven't seen that personally in my portfolio. It does happen, and it's messy. I mean, how you unwind from that? Actually somebody does come to mind that's going through a business divorce, and essentially they're walking away from what they had, and they're interested to the point where they're going to essentially take nothing for what they owned previously and go out and just buy new practice on their own. And so the situation can sometimes be that bad that somebody's willing to just say, see ya. Yeah. And if I can be out, let's be done. I know dentists who would sell a partnership to someone for, say, half their practice for $650,000, and then 5 years later spend $650,000 in legal fees to get them out of their office, and then have to pay them back the other $650,000. I mean, it's like how bad does this story get? What other trends are you seeing in this?
Other trends, primarily when I think of trends right now, the first thing that comes out is real estate, right? I mean, that's, we've talked about that just a little bit. Construction, real estate, there is just a tremendous appetite for growth among a lot of doctors right now. Limited supply, we've talked about that a little bit as well. And so there's a lot of appetite, if I were to sum it up, I guess. A lot of appetite for growth, limited supply. There's some doctors that I'm talking to, they don't like what they see on the market. And they are, and I alluded to this earlier, they are calling up doctors themselves. They're networking. They're really having to dig in a lot more than I had seen previously to try and find opportunities to own a practice. And so trend-wise, that's been interesting to watch. I'm sure that those cycles have happened, previously, but this is, I run a small, like a social networking group. It's for dentists only, and we'll go shooting. We like to go to the shooting range periodically, like once a quarter, right? So it's just for fun. And this for me started as just something for me and a couple clients to just go and do. And next thing you know, they're bringing their friends, and there's a bunch of networking happening, and there's deals being put together, and so now it's kind of morphed, right? And what was intended to be kind of a boutique appreciation thing is kind of morphed, and so there is, as far as trends go, there's a tremendous amount of desire out there to meet, doctors, to find opportunities that just aren't, falling in their laps, because those are few and far between.
So have you ever gone to the C2 Tactical?
Yeah, that's where we go. Yeah.
My son works there.
Oh, really? Which one? The one right here?
The one right in Tempe.
Yeah.
I have 4 boys. I grew up with 5 sisters, so I played Barbie dolls till I was 12. I'm living proof that it's crazy. And I have 4 boys, and 2 of them just love elk hunting, deer hunting, shooting weapons, and oh my God, he goes down there so many times they begged him to work there. So that's his part-time job at C2 Tactical.
That's where we go. That's a great place.
His name's Zach. He's the tall, good-looking kid. And
there's a thing in the dental community with firearms. I mean, they just love it.
Email me and I'll reply to Zach.
Okay.
So you and Zach,
we'll get hooked up. We've even established a little name. We're the Red Dot Dental Club. That's what we call it.
The Red Dot Dental Club. Well, I want to go down there and shoot at C2 Tactical with my son Zach and the R2 Dental Club. Well, that makes me think right out of the bait. Okay, so you're a banker, a dental banker, and you hang out with dentists shooting guns. Are you saying a banker can add value to this type of dental transaction as opposed? I mean, if I want to buy a product for $750,000, I mean, is there a difference between buying on my Visa or having a relationship with a banker?
Yeah,
Can you add value to it?
The having, I talked about the team earlier. Having your team set up. There's a doctor right now that I know that's buying a practice, or he's interested in buying a practice, and this individual has done a phenomenal job at building the team up well in advance of actually making a purchase. And so I've been talking with this individual for probably 8 months now, maybe 7 months. And we have been collecting, we've collected some financial information on this person, and I'm able to, keep an eye out for opportunities that come up. I'm not a broker. I'm not here to broker practices. That's not my business, but I can say, hey, I heard about this, go talk to this person, or, and so this person has been able to essentially do a pre-flight. That's what we call, when somebody's trying to prepare to buy and we want to run things past the bank, we've essentially been able to do a pre-flight on this individual. So when they find the right practice, they're ready to go. And so it takes it's a lot less scary for that individual. We're able to answer a tremendous amount of questions. Once you get talking, you'll be amazed at the number of questions that come out. So in terms of pre-purchase activity, I think getting involved early with the banker and the rest of that team is critical. In terms of selling, banks and myself will occasionally offer a pre-sale evaluation of the practice, see how bankable that practice is. So if that practice goes to hit the market, a bank's already looked at to say, yeah, these financials work. So we'll do that for seller, buyer, and a lot of that's really relationship driven. It takes a lot of trust for somebody these aren't formal appraisals that we're doing or anything like that. This is us saying, hey, spitballing, this looks like it would work, right? We're not going through full underwriting. So those are the relationship elements that you get when you establish a good connection with a banker. There's a lot of other things that come up. There's just the number of issues that will come up in your dental career it's endless. And I get phone calls all the time with stuff that I never thought of before. And it's like, well, I don't know. Let me think about that. And so there are just situations, the divorce situations, being able to kind of work through that with a trusted advisor. If that were to happen, those conversations are very common. In terms of fraud, there's a tremendous amount of fraud out there. And a really good banker. Some people view banks and bankers as just give me the rate, give me the loan, and we're out. And that's fine. I realize there's some transactional people out there, but those that take the time to kind of work with us often benefit. There's a practice that I was looking at recently that experienced check fraud. It was internal. The office manager was stealing from the doctor, and you can set certain checks and balances in place, and generally your accountant will be the one to kind of help you establish those things, but we can help identify things from the banking standpoint. There's products like Positive Pay out there. There's ways to structure your accounts that can help pick up odd transactions. And you don't really get that if you don't establish and have a conversation.
For Dental Town.
Oh yeah, and fraud is so prevalent. We see it all the time from the least suspecting people, even family members. Right. And I can't emphasize that enough. And talking about fraud, it seems to be one of those things that only gets worse and worse and worse. And people just seem to get more creative. So the bank has deployed tools to help combat these things. And you have to have a conversation, with a banker that knows what they're doing to say, hey, here's how we're set up. Does this make sense? Because anybody can come in, just open up an account. From there, some people are on their own, and some people that take the time to get that counsel.
What percent of dentists do you think today are being embezzled against?
Oh my gosh. On some scale, I would say I haven't done research on this. I'm totally spitballing right now. If I had to guess, it's probably 20% on some level. Now, significant frauds, I would say, are probably much lower than that. I would say probably in that 2% range, right? But to fraud to some extent, I just guarantee you it's happening. That's my suspicion.
Every dental consultant I've podcasted who's done this for over a decade or two or three, just in-office consulting, say they find it half the time when they go into an office. But of course, now these are offices that obviously bring in a consultant, because they're wondering,
there was something going on.
I work my butt off and I don't have any money. Well, that's your first red flag. You're a doctor in America. You work your butt off. You're really busy and you don't have any money. Hello.
No, and they get busy. They don't think about the business. They trust people way too much.
And I'll say that is the money is nothing. I mean, you're not going to take any money with you when you die, but everyone I know, it's reduced them to tears because the lady embezzling was their baby's godmother during baptism. They went on family vacation. It was matters of the heart. They just could not believe that the least suspecting person in their mind was the culprit.
Well, and you can, establishing dual control is an easy thing to do. I mean, there's some things that you can do very easily in the practice. These are just common sense things. These are things that you can do on your own. You don't need our help. But there is technology out there. I'll highlight positive pay as one of them, right?
You should do an article on that.
Yeah, we'll do an article on that. I mean, these are inexpensive banking products. No bank, and us included.
What is
it's called positive pay. That's just one.
Is that
tool.
From your bank?
It's a pretty common term amongst all banks.
It's called positive.
It's called positive pay, and so when somebody writes a check, they indicate it in our system that check is going out, and here's the amount, and here's who it's going to. So what that does is, when you send a check out, all of your banking information is on that check, right? You're essentially trusting that person with your bank account number, right? It's right there it's not hard to see. So positive pay will match up checks that you write to what hits the system, so that there's never a mismatch between the two. Check fraud is extremely common. People can wash checks. There's just a million issues that can happen. And so having a system like positive pay, it's inexpensive. That's part of that dual control process. You could establish one person could do the positive pay, so there's ways to do it, and it's inexpensive, and it happens all the time. It's just it doesn't need to. So that, and the other thing I'll add is just, I guess, somewhat related, is credit monitoring. A lot of doctors surprisingly don't have credit monitoring. They don't know what their score is, and if it takes a sudden drop, doctors are targets often of fraud and identity theft. And so having credit monitoring along with some of these controls is cheap insurance, for your personal and professional life.
Yeah, and my gosh, overhead. The largest overhead is not even on your books. I mean, it's your adjusted fee from, you say you charge $1,000 for a crown, but the insurance only gives you, your PPO gives you $650. So $350 out of your bank is the PPO adjusted fee. Then there's your fee. The average is 35%. Then there's staff, 20 to 28. I see all the time. Supplies 6%. The last thing you need is embezzlement in your overhead. I mean, it's just it's just tough. It's tough, and it's very emotional when you find out that this person that you trust is doing that.
Well, and often there's nothing you can do to recoup that money, right? It's very difficult. Somebody's usually going to go to jail, and you're probably not going to get that money back. And we've seen some folks suffer some serious personal consequences. We talked about short sales. I've seen doctors forced to, into a foreclosure short sale situation because of embezzlement in the practice. So it's a very real thing, and it's something that you can prevent, or at least you can put safeguards into to help offset.
Last question. I can't believe we already went over an hour. You've been very fun and informative.
Well, thank you, Howard. It's good to be here. I feel like I'm with a celebrity right now. So.
Oh no. But I'm just curious, because I live in a jaded world because I'm a dentist with an MBA, and I've been interested in the business of dentistry my whole career. But what letter grade would you give dentists? How informed are they? When you meet up with them, are they just like, oh my God, this is a biologist? I mean, he wants to talk about eukaryotes and fungi. How knowledgeable are they about this whole transaction?
They're usually not knowledgeable at all. I'll be completely frank with you. There's very few doctors that, when we go to sign loan documents, this is just one example, that really understand what they're signing. I'm always happy to explain, but there's just a lack of a lack of interest. There's a thought, well, I couldn't do anything about it even if I had a disagreement. So I'm forced to sign this. In reality, there's, you can get draft loan documents from a bank in advance of doing a transaction and have some time to actually review those. But the thing is that most doctors just don't understand or care. They don't really understand what a commercial security agreement is. If you buy a practice, you're going to sign that. They don't really understand what a personal guarantee is. They don't understand what cross guarantee or cross collateralization is if you own multiple practices, or have multiple partners involved. So
yeah, but we know the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote.
Yes, and that's important. That's important. But there's general. Most doctors frankly don't understand. And when we go to sit down and sign, and I'll sit down, and many times their spouse is on the loan with them as well as a guarantor. We're in Arizona. We're in a community property state. It's not uncommon for that to happen. And I'll often sit down with the spouse. Okay, do you understand what you're signing? Do you have any questions? They have no idea. They're just like, no, just show me where to sign and we'll be done here. And so personally, I try and do my best to explain, okay, here's what you're signing. This is what this means. Here's the pitfalls. Like here's the things that you don't want to do, right? These are some reporting requirements if it's a larger loan, those types of things. Some loans will have covenants. A lot of folks aren't aware that would even exist on a dental loan. And so having this kind of goes back to that relationship. You need to have somebody in your corner that you can have a frank discussion with. Okay, what's in here? What should I watch out for? Prepayment penalties. It's not uncommon to have on a practice loan or a real estate loan. Is that prepayment penalty based on the original loan amount, or is it based on the current balance? That could have a significant impact. Can you make any extra payments without triggering that prepayment penalty? Most people have no idea. And so education and taking your time to understand what is in there can save you a lot of time and money.
Well, it sounds like you know my homies well.
Yeah.
I know my homies well.
It
sounds like you know them well. It's kind of like sometimes I'll be talking to somebody from another country like Australia or whatever. They'll say, well, Americans would never do that. And I'm like, sounds like you haven't been to America. Sounds like you haven't met very many Americans.
Yeah.
I know Americans well, and I know Dennis well. But thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
It was an honor.
Was a blast.
And I hope someday we're both. What's your favorite thing to shoot at C2 Tactical?
I don't. I just give me a whatever and I'll shoot it. I really don't even have a preference. I like a sampler though. So we'll just try out some different things.
Someday we'll be shooting in there with Zach. That'll be fun.
Let's go do it.
All right. Thank you so much for coming by.